So we have this new reading comprehension passage, and we are going to read this passage the way we would do it in the exam in the first reading. So, as I told you always, that your first reading has to be quick and it has to be effective simultaneously. So, what should you do in the first reading? Some very important points are given here on the right hand corner. It says you have to ignore the intricate details, you have to map the key nouns, you have to get the gist of the paragraph, and you have to leave the part that you find difficult to understand. So these things always you have to keep in mind, and you have to read these kind of passages with the idea that you want to finish this within 2 minutes, right? So let's read the first paragraph. It says, until recently, few historians were interested in analyzing the similarities and differences between serfdom in Russia and slavery in the US. So the author says few historians were interested in analyzing the similarities and difference between two things. So there seems to be something about slavery in Russia and US. Even Alexis de Tocqueville, who recognized the significant comparability of the two nations, never compared their systems of servitude, despite his interest in United States slavery. So the author says that Russia and US have never been compared with respect to their slavery. Moreover, the almost simultaneous abolition of Russian serfdom and US slavery in the 1860s, a riveting coincidence that should have drawn more modern scholars to a comparative study of the two systems, has failed to arouse the interest of these scholars. Though some historians may have been put off by the forbidding political differences between 19th century Russia and US, one an imperial monarchy and the other a federal democracy, a recent study by Peter Kolchin identifies differences that are illuminating, particularly with regard to the different kinds of rebellion exhibited by slaves and serfs. So, what do you have in the first paragraph? In the first paragraph, the author says that somehow historians should have shown interest in what? In comparing the slavery in the US and serfdom in Russia. But then somehow they haven't done it. This is what the broader message is. So, if you look at this paragraph and you ask me what are the important things that we come across historians as if they have not done something. The author keeps on repeating that it has failed to arouse the interest, and some historians may have been put off by something, few historians were interested. So the interest of the historians is dominating this paragraph, and interest of historians for what? In what? In comparing and understanding the serfdom in Russia and slavery in the US. So they have failed to compare, actually. That is the point he's trying to make. And then he says that towards the end that a recent study by Peter Kolchin identifies differences that are illuminating, particularly with regard to the different kinds of rebellion. So Peter Kolchin is the person who has done some kind of study, and the author says this is illuminating. So let's go and see what we have in the second paragraph. In the second paragraph, the author says that Kolchin points out that nobles owning serfs in Russia constituted only a tiny proportion of the population, while in the southern United States, about a quarter of all white people were members of slave-owning families. And although in the southern US only 2% of slaves worked on plantations where more than 100 slaves worked, in Russia almost 80% of the serfs worked for nobles who owned more than 100 serfs. In Russia, most serfs rarely saw their owners, who tended to rely on intermediaries to manage their estates, while most southern planters lived on their land and interacted with slaves on a regular basis. So what do you have in the second paragraph? The author is making clear-cut distinction. It is not author, it is Kolchin who has observed a few things, and the author is mentioning what the things that Kolchin observed. He says that Kolchin points out the differences between how the slaves were present in US and how the serfs were present in Russia. So lots of points of differences and differences have been brought in paragraph 2. There is no need for you to remember. But what do you have in paragraph 2? You have numbers. How many slaves and how many serfs in respective this, right? So let's go and have a third paragraph, right? So third paragraph says these differences in demographics. So what do you have in the earlier paragraph? Differences in graphics. So the author says these differences in demographics partly explain differences in the kinds of resistance that slaves and serfs practiced in their respective countries. Both serfs and slaves engaged in a wide variety of rebellious activity, from silent sabotage, much of which has escaped the historical record, to organized armed rebellions, which were more common in Russia. The practice of absentee ownership, combined with the large numbers in which serfs were owned, probably contributed significantly to the four great rebellions that swept across Russia at roughly 50-year intervals in 17th and 18th centuries. So the author now talks about the rebellions and how they resulted, and mentions something about Russia. And then he says further, the last of the three occurring between 1773 and 1774, and listed more than 1 million serfs in futile attempt to overthrow Russian nobility. So the author has become very much particular about the armed rebellion in Russia and the armed rebellion by the serfs. And then he says Russian serfs also practiced in smaller acts of collective defiance called the Volneny, which typically started with a group of serfs who complained of grievances by petition and went out on strike. Confrontations between slaves and plantation authorities were also common, but they tended to be much less collective in nature than those that occurred in Russia, probably in part because the number of workers on each estate was smaller in the US than was the case in Russia. So what do you have in the last paragraph? The author clearly points out that in Russia there were armed rebellions by the serfs, and he goes on towards the end to say that that confrontations between slaves were also common, but they were less collective. Right? So what happens in this paragraph? The author wants to point out the differences between serfdom in Russia and slavery in the US. And he mentions some kind of demographic detail in the second paragraph. In the third paragraph, he talks about the armed rebellion by the serfs in Russia, and how such armed rebellions were not seen in the US. So if you have gone through this, you will realize that the author in the first paragraph talks about how historians, or how few historians, have shown interest in comparing the similarities and differences between serfdom in Russia and slavery in the US. So he says that first. Towards the end, he says that Kolchin has did some kind of study. It's a recent study, and then in the second and the third paragraph, he goes on to explain what Kolchin has seen or what Kolchin has discovered, and then he says that Kolchin points out some kind of demographic discussion has happened here in second paragraph, and so number of planters, so number of serfs were there in the respective places. And then he goes on to explain how the serfs turned into rebellion, organized rebellion, which was not there in the US. So this is overall picture of the how far we have done. So it says ignore the intricate details. See, there are not many details, of course there are some numbers given about the number of slaves, the number of serfs, and this and that. So those are the intricate details which we have, but we can ignore them for the time being. What do you have now? It says map the key noun. Now this is very important. We have to map the key nouns, and we realize that the most important thing is serfdom. So if you ask the key nouns, I would write it down here. The first key noun that is very important is slavery in the US and serfdom in Russia. So the author says that these two should always have attracted the attention of the historians, but few historians have shown interest in comparing slavery in the US and serfdom in Russia. Kolchin has done this in a recent study, and what Kolchin has observed has been explained by the author. He says that Kolchin has observed that and he points out that Kolchin has observed that there is some demographic differences between the two, and then these demographic differences was the reason behind why in Russia you had armed rebellion by the serfs, but you did not have this kind of a thing among the slaves in the US. So this is broadly the story, and this is how we can connect the dots. Now, this kind of passage is very simple. Why? Because a clear-cut difference has been brought out between two entities. There was nothing complicated. There was nothing which is very intricate and demands 2 or 3 reading. So I would say overall a very easy